Hello, everyone. Today we will embark on an exciting and perilous journey with a man whose name is forever inscribed in the history of great seafarers and discoverers, a man who challenged the unknown and attempted to circumnavigate the globe. We will talk about Ferdinand Magellan. Most of us know from school textbooks. Ferdinand Magellan completed the first circumnavigation of the Earth in human history. But in reality, as often happens with great undertakings, fate decreed otherwise. Death tragically broke the circle he so passionately wanted to complete. He did not reach his native shores, only his few, exhausted but surviving companions returned home on a single ship. About 265, or according to other data, about 280 people on 5 ships embarked on this unprecedented and desperately bold voyage around the entire globe, and almost 3 years later, only 18 emaciated Europeans returned. Such was the price of this grandiose feat. But Ferdinand Magellan was such an outstanding, purposeful, and indomitable personality that the first circumnavigation is still rightly associated with his name. For it was his indomitable will, his experience, his knowledge, and his faith in success that allowed this expedition to take place and overcome unimaginable difficulties. The Strait of Magellan, a narrow and treacherous waterway between the southern tip of the South American continent and the Tierra del Fuego archipelago, extremely difficult to navigate even to this day due to strong currents, frequent storms, and fogs is quite rightly named after him. But the vast Pacific Ocean, which he was the first European to cross, he named so in essence by misunderstanding. The fact is that for almost 4 months, while his flotilla crossed this uncharted expanse of water, the ocean was indeed surprisingly calm and quiet, as if specially favoring Magellan and his exhausted crew. Yet in reality, this ocean, the largest on the planet, is famous for its frequent and destructive storms, hurricanes, and typhoons, and it would have been more correct to call it the turbulent, raging, or Great Ocean, as the Spanish, following Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the first European to see it from the American shore, originally called it. Good heavens, from what rubbish, from what contradictory and sometimes base motives did the great geographical discoveries of that era grow? The driving force was not only noble curiosity, the desire to know the world and achieve fame, but often also bitter failures, personal unsettledness and grievances, insatiable greed and thirst for profit on the part of both the navigator himself and those powerful rulers and merchants who sent him on a dangerous journey, as well as state espionage, fierce competition, and the ruthless division of spheres of influence between maritime powers. All this fully affected the turbulent, adventurous, and tragic life of Ferdinand Magellan. His own motivation was complex. Here was the desire to prove his point to the Portuguese king who had rejected him, the aspiration for wealth promised by spices, and, undoubtedly, a sincere belief in the possibility of finding a western route and glorifying his name, as well as spreading the Christian faith among pagans. Psychologically, he was a man of incredible inner strength, capable of pursuing a goal regardless of any obstacles, but at the same time, perhaps, excessively proud, intolerant of objections, and not always flexible in relations with subordinates, which led to numerous conflicts. His fanatical conviction in his own rightness and divine destiny, on the one hand, gave him the strength to move forward, but on the other, could lead to tragic mistakes, as happened at Mactan. He was born around 1480, the exact date of his birth is unknown, in the north of Portugal, in a small, mountainous, and rather poor region of Trás os Montes, which literally translated from Portuguese means behind the mountains. In early childhood, the future great traveler and navigator probably did not even see the boundless sea that would later become his destiny and his grave. But then, having arrived at court and seen the ocean for the first time, his entire subsequent life was subordinated to one all-consuming aspiration: to be at sea, to discover new lands, to serve his king and his faith. And what an outstanding, experienced, and fearless sailor he became. It is interesting to note that much later, already in the service of the Spanish king and preparing for his great voyage, Ferdinand Magellan in official documents indicated the Portuguese city of Porto as his birthplace, a large seaport and the closest significant settlement to his native home, from where, in fact, one could first see the boundless ocean. Ferdinand Magellan came from an ancient, but by that time greatly impoverished Portuguese noble family. His surname in Portuguese, Magalhães, precisely meant a representative of the minor, run-down nobility, a kind of impoverished hidalgo. There were a great many such poor but proud and ambitious nobles in Portugal and Spain at that time, and many of them sought fame, wealth, and adventure in overseas colonial campaigns and expeditions. Ferdinand Magellan, as it turned out, also had many namesakes, which created certain difficulties for his biographers. When historians and researchers seriously began to study his biography, it proved very difficult to establish with complete certainty where in the surviving archival documents and chronicles it was specifically about him and where about some other, Magalhães. Unfortunately, practically nothing is reliably known about Ferdinand Magellan's childhood and early education. It is assumed that at the age of about 12, around 1492, he, thanks to his impeccable noble origin and, possibly, the patronage of some influential relatives, was sent to the court of the Portuguese king John II the Perfect, and became a page to his wife, Queen Leonor of Viseu, a famous and enlightened patroness of arts, sciences, and literature. Here, in the courtly environment, in the royal palace in Lisbon, young Magellan undoubtedly received a good education and upbringing for his time. He certainly learned to read, write, count, the basics of Latin, court etiquette, music, dancing, fencing, and horse riding, and also, especially importantly for his future career, he could get acquainted with the basics of navigation, cartography, and cosmography, which were actively developing in Portugal during that era of great maritime discoveries. The royal court was a place where the best minds gathered, the latest geographical news was discussed, and Magellan eagerly absorbed knowledge that would later help him in his daring enterprises. This court school gave him not only education, but also an understanding of the complexities of politics and human relations, and also, perhaps, sowed the first dreams of distant lands and uncharted seas. He could listen to the stories of captains returning from voyages, see rare maps and navigational instruments, such as the astrolabe and quadrant, and learn to determine latitude by the stars. The royal palace in Lisbon at that time was located in the ancient castle of St. George, situated on a high hill and representing a former powerful Arab fortress, rebuilt by Portuguese kings. It was a very impressive and somewhat gloomy medieval building with thick walls, high towers, and many spacious halls, where court life, full of intrigues, ceremonies, and anticipation of news from overseas expeditions, seethed. Relatively small in territory and population, Portugal, located on the westernmost tip of the Iberian Peninsula, washed by the waters of the Atlantic Ocean, nevertheless, at the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century, laid claim to world maritime and trade dominance. Its vast colonial empire began to form rapidly after another famous Portuguese navigator, Vasco da Gama, successfully completed his historic voyage in 1498 and discovered a direct sea route to India around Africa. Portugal, lacking significant land military power and large human resources, managed, thanks only to the incredible courage, bravery, enterprise, and sometimes cruelty of its sailors, conquistadors, and merchants, as well as superiority in shipbuilding and naval artillery, to capture and establish numerous trading posts and military colonies in East and West Africa, in India, on Ceylon, in Southeast Asia, on the Moluccas, and even in Brazil in a short time. On the coasts of these distant lands, the Portuguese built fortified ports and forts, where their heavily laden ships regularly arrived for slaves, gold, ivory, exotic goods, and, most importantly, for fabulously expensive Eastern spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon. In essence, this colonial expansion and trade often represented well-organized and ruthless plunder and exploitation of the local population and natural resources. Portugal's main and most dangerous competitor in the struggle for world maritime domination and colonial possessions was neighboring Spain, which in 1479 finally united into a single powerful kingdom thanks to the dynastic marriage between Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon, the so-called Catholic monarchs. Queen Isabella was famous for her deep and even fanatical piety. She was the initiator of the expulsion of Jews and Moors from Spain and the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition. King Ferdinand, on the other hand, was known for his incredible cunning, political treachery, and insatiable greed for money and power. This all-consuming thirst for profit and aspiration for world domination were fully transmitted to their powerful successors on the Spanish throne, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V Habsburg, who was also King of Spain under the name Charles I, and his son Philip II. Between Portugal and Spain throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, there was a fierce and irreconcilable struggle for the discovery, capture, and division of new lands and sea routes. In 1493, immediately after Christopher Columbus's first voyage and his discovery of America, the then Pope Alexander VI Borgia, himself a Spaniard by origin, and seeking to act as supreme arbiter in disputes between Christian sovereigns, relying on the calculations and advice of his court cosmographers and astrologers, drew an imaginary demarcation line across the Atlantic Ocean, which at that time did not yet have its modern name and was considered part of the Ocean Sea. This line ran approximately 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands and the Azores. All newly discovered or yet undiscovered lands and seas located west of this conventional line were declared potentially belonging to Spain. Everything located east of it, accordingly, fell into Portugal's sphere of influence. A year later, in 1494, by the Treaty of Tordesillas between Spain and Portugal, this line was shifted somewhat westward, which eventually allowed Portugal to claim Brazil. Thus, the vast, recently discovered American continent became the Oporne Tochke and main sphere of interest for Spain. For Portugal, however, Africa, India, Malacca, and the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia remained the main direction of colonial expansion and source of wealth. In Ferdinand Magellan's later life and fate, this division of the world between the two maritime powers played a huge and decisive role, as his project of a western route to the Spice Islands affected the interests of both crowns and required an accurate determination of the Moluccas' location relative to the demarcation line. The question of who owned these richest islands became one of the main geopolitical disputes of the era, and Magellan's expedition was intended to provide an answer in favor of Spain. Portugal in the early 16th century was rapidly transforming into a powerful colonial empire, and its capital, Lisbon, into one of the largest and richest trading ports, an important political and cultural center of a significant part of the then civilized world. Therefore, at the royal court in Lisbon, paramount importance was attached to lavish and strict court ceremonial, etiquette, hierarchy, and external manifestations of royal majesty. Ferdinand Magellan, a young and impoverished nobleman from a distant and remote province, finding himself in this atmosphere of capital court life, imperial luxury, intrigue, and rivalry, had to either quickly adapt to it or seek another path for self-realization. But he apparently never made a brilliant court career. After serving for about 3 years as a page at Queen Leonor's court, he, having reached adulthood around 1505 at the age of about 25, joined the royal fleet as a junior soldier or supernumerary warrior, sobresaliente. How and why did this happen? There is no precise information on this matter, only various versions and assumptions. Perhaps the changes in his fate and his departure from court were related to the death in 1495 of King John II, who may have patronized young Magellan. The Dowager Queen Leonor, after her husband's death, no longer had her former real power and influence at court. The new Portuguese king Manuel I the Fortunate, who ascended the throne, was an ambitious, imperious, and very scrupulous man in matters of court etiquette. He further complicated and tightened the already lavish and solemn court ceremonial. Servile adulation of the royal person and his will intensified significantly at court. This undoubtedly reflected both his personal character and temperament, and the ever-increasing imperial ambitions and claims of Portugal to world domination. Why exactly King Manuel became a personal enemy and persecutor of Ferdinand Magellan for the rest of his life is not reliably known. Perhaps Magellan, being a proud, independent, and straightforward man, somehow displeased or did not appeal to the new king, or became a victim of some court intrigues and slander. In any case, Ferdinand Magellan apparently found the courage and determination not to cling to the dubious prospects of court service, which promised him neither fame nor fortune. And at the age of 25, he, like many other impoverished Portuguese nobles of that time, decided to drastically change his fate and become a simple sailor or soldier in the royal fleet, setting off in search of fortune and adventure on distant and dangerous overseas expeditions. This was just one of his many bold and risky acts in life. Instead of trying to devote himself to court intrigues, flattery, and seeking patronage, he chose the difficult and dangerous path of naval service and set off as part of one of the first major Portuguese military trading expeditions to the east, to India, under the command of the first Portuguese Viceroy of India, Francisco de Almeida. He served off the coast of East Africa, participated in the capture and plunder of Arab cities, then in India. Later, during a military campaign in Morocco, in the Battle of Azamur in 1513, he was seriously wounded in the leg by a spear and limped for the rest of his life, which, however, did not break his will and determination. This limp, perhaps, even strengthened his inner resolve and perseverance, as he constantly had to overcome physical limitations. Ferdinand Magellan was short, stocky, sturdily built, and limped noticeably when walking, but he was distinguished by incredible physical strength, endurance, iron will, fearless courage, and indomitable perseverance in achieving his goals. He, as an experienced sailor, knew seamanship very well, could command a ship in any weather, and was well versed in navigation and cartography. He also knew how to find common ground and communicate with ordinary sailors and experienced pilots, who at that time were respectfully called maestros in the fleet. If necessary, he did not shy away from any of the heaviest and dirtiest work on the ship. He could himself carry heavy loads, load equipment, or repair damage. According to contemporaries, he was a just man, though stern, and could even spend his last personal funds to help sick or needy poor sailors. His character combined the strictness of a commander with concern for his subordinates, which, however, did not always save him from conflicts, especially with those who challenged his authority or were lazy in performing their duties. He was a man of action, not words, and his leadership was based on personal example and profound knowledge. But Magellan's military and naval career in Portuguese service somehow did not work out. Fate, it seemed, was not too kind to him. Despite all his merits, bravery, and experience, he received neither high ranks nor rich rewards, nor special favor from the king and his entourage. After serving in Africa, Ferdinand Magellan again went to the east and fought for several years in India and Southeast Asia. He participated in the famous and bloody naval battle off the island of Diu in 1509, as a result of which the Portuguese fleet inflicted a crushing defeat on the combined fleet of Egyptian Mamluks, Gujaratis, and other Indian rulers, thereby definitively establishing Portuguese maritime dominance and influence in the Indian Ocean. By this time, that is, by the beginning of the 16th century, most educated Europeans, thanks to the revival of ancient knowledge and new geographical discoveries, no longer doubted that the earth was spherical, not flat, as medieval church cosmography asserted. Once, back in deep antiquity, the idea of a spherical earth was expressed as a brilliant guess or a scientifically substantiated hypothesis by ancient Greek scholar-philosophers, such as Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle. But the European Middle Ages, under the strong influence of Christian theology, forgot this advanced ancient idea for a long time, and sometimes even consciously crossed it out, distorted, or rejected it. The Christian Church, relying on a literal interpretation of certain passages of Holy Scripture, for a long time categorically rejected the idea of a spherical earth and antipodes and accepted as an unshakable and obvious truth the archaic notion of the Earth's structure as a flat disk or rectangle, surrounded on all sides by the boundless world ocean. However, during the Renaissance and early modern period, thanks to the humanist movement, the translation and study of ancient authors, as well as successes in navigation and cartography, the idea of a spherical Earth returned to European science and culture and became almost universally accepted among educated people. Ferdinand Magellan's contemporaries, such as Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Amerigo Vespucci, and other navigators, were already quite clearly aware that by sailing west, it was theoretically possible to reach the eastern shores of Asia and India. The main question now was to decide to practically carry out such a voyage, to correctly imagine the enormous distance that would have to be overcome, to try to measure and calculate it as accurately as possible, and finally, to find the courage and strength to actually overcome it. What was supposed to drive these desperate people? An insatiable thirst for discovery, incredible courage and bravery bordering on madness? Or were these some special psychological qualities, a new type of personality that the turbulent and contradictory Renaissance era, with its cult of individualism, enterprise, and striving for fame, was forming? Most likely, it was a combination of all these factors, multiplied by economic interests, religious zeal, and the political ambitions of European monarchies. There was also a naive notion that uncharted lands were full not only of dangers, but also of untold treasures and wonders, which also spurred the imagination and determination. The brave navigators of that era set out on an unknown, perilous, and arduous journey, never before trodden by anyone, on small and imperfect wooden sailing ships, so-called caravels or naus, whose dimensions today are simply frightening in their insignificance. The length of such ships usually was only 20 to 30 meters, and the width from 7 to 10 meters. On this tiny, cramped, and constantly rocking space, creaking, bending, and swaying under the blows of waves and wind, under primitive square or lateen sails, with minimal and rapidly spoiling supplies of fresh water and food, which almost never sufficed for a very distant and long voyage, they, guided only by imperfect maps, compass, and astrolabe, bravely set off into unknown and frightening ocean expanses towards uncertainty, storms, hunger, diseases, and possible death. Living conditions, El Merdon board, were appalling. Cramped quarters, unsanitary conditions, rats, insects, monotonous and meager food consisting mainly of worm-eaten biscuits and salted meat, rotten water, constant danger of shipwreck, pirate attacks, or hostile natives. Discipline was maintained by extremely harsh methods, including corporal punishment and even the death penalty. The psychological tension on months-long voyages, far from home and civilization, was enormous, often leading to despair, mutinies, and madness. Sailors suffered not only from physical hardships, but also from fear of unknown monsters, which, according to beliefs, teemed in the ocean depths. How did fate lead Ferdinand Magellan to this daring plan and its execution? After several years of service in India in 1509, after receiving several wounds there, he, as part of a Portuguese reconnaissance flotilla under the command of Diogo Lopes de Sequeira, set off for the shores of the distant and then little known to Europeans Malay Peninsula in Southeast Asia. These places, as well as the nearby Moluccas, were called the Spice Islands by Europeans, as it was from there that the most valuable and expensive Eastern goods came to Europe. Today, various spices and seasonings are in almost everyone's kitchen, and we do not attach special importance to them. But in the 15th and 16th centuries in Europe, the situation was completely different. When reselling in European cities the same spices acquired by European merchants directly in the Moluccas or from Arab intermediaries, their price increased tens or even hundreds of times, according to some data, even 200 times. This brought European merchants who monopolized the spice trade truly unimaginable, fabulous profits. Of course, a significant part of the expensive goods could spoil or be lost en route during a long and dangerous sea voyage. It also happened that a ship with valuable cargo was robbed by pirates or simply sank during a storm. But the potential profit was so great that enterprising and risk-taking spice traders were ready to do anything, overcoming any difficulties and dangers for the sake of obtaining this incredible super profit. Why were spices valued so incredibly highly in that distant era, literally worth their weight in gold? Partly this was due to the fact that the Renaissance meant a profound revolution in all spheres of European society, including gastronomic culture, in cooking. One of the most famous and immoderate gourmands was, for example, in the 16th century, the English King Henry VIII. He, as is known, largely ruined his health precisely by unrestrained overeating and drunkenness. A new passion for diverse, exquisite, and exotic dishes and drinks replaced millennia of rather simple, monotonous, and often meager medieval food. Medieval European peasants, who constituted the vast majority of the population, usually ate very simple food: rye or barley bread, various grain porridges, legumes, vegetables, and often there was very little of all this, especially in lean years. Meat on their table was a great rarity, a real holiday. Wealthier people, feudal lords and townspeople, of course, also had meat on their table, for example, a whole leg of lamb or a roasted piglet, but even these were often prepared rather crudely, without special culinary refinements and seasonings. And suddenly, during the Renaissance, with the expansion of trade links and cultural contacts with the East, it turned out that food could be not only satisfying, but also incredibly diverse, aromatic, and very tasty, if various overseas spices and seasonings were used. In addition, at this time there was a general revival of interest in ancient traditions, including the refined culture of feasts and banquets of the late Roman Empire, where, as is known, there was a real cult of exquisite and exotic food. It is enough to recall at least the legendary pâté of nightingale tongues or stuffed peacocks. For the upper and wealthy strata of European society of the Renaissance, consuming expensive and complex dishes with rare and exotic Eastern seasonings also meant demonstrating their high social status, wealth, education, and belonging to the cultural elite. Furthermore, spices were used not only in cooking, but also in medicine, perfumery, and for preserving food, which was especially important in the absence of refrigerators. Portuguese King Manuel I entrusted Admiral Cerqueira with reconnoitering and, if possible, developing the rich Moluccas, turning them into a reliable military trading base for Portugal in the Far East, and trying from there to find a sea route to legendary and fabulously wealthy China. The Portuguese, like other European colonizers, always wanted more. They wanted to move further and further east. They dreamed of unimaginable treasures and riches of distant and mysterious eastern countries. As part of this reconnaissance flotilla, Ferdinand Magellan participated in numerous skirmishes and, in essence, outright piratical attacks on local Malay, Arab, and Chinese merchant ships. In these battles, he repeatedly showed exceptional personal courage, bravery, and resourcefulness, saving his comrades from attacks by natives or from shipwreck. But despite all his merits, he received from the king and his officials neither significant rewards, nor promotion in rank, nor monetary remuneration, and he desperately needed all three, as he remained an impoverished nobleman. He apparently never managed to improve his family's affairs. While in the East, in India and Malacca, Ferdinand Magellan tried to engage in independent private trade to somehow improve his financial situation. But here, too, he met with failure. His trading partner, to whom he entrusted his modest savings, turned out to be a dishonest man and simply appropriated all the profits. Then Magellan, having borrowed money, at his own risk assembled a small cargo of valuable spices and, together with a few loyal sailors, tried to transport it independently to Portugal on a small rented vessel, hoping to sell it profitably. However, near the coast of India, his ship was wrecked during a storm. Despite all desperate efforts, he failed to save the expensive cargo. In 1513, after almost 8 years of continuous service in the East, he returned to Portugal completely destitute, without money, without connections, and without much hope for the future. Even when he, as a cripple and veteran of many wars, appealed to the king to compensate him for the cost of a warhorse lost during his service in Morocco, he, after long delays, was paid only a paltry half of its real price. His repeated requests to increase his allowance, that is, monetary maintenance or salary, after almost 10 years of loyal and dangerous service to the fatherland, were also met with an arrogant and humiliating refusal. Moreover, when King Manuel once finally received the disgraced and impoverished Magellan in his palace, he, as a sign of his extreme displeasure and contempt, demonstratively did not offer him his royal hand for the traditional kiss. For a proud and ambitious Portuguese nobleman, as Ferdinand Magellan undoubtedly was, this was a terrible, unbearable public insult and humiliation. Perhaps this was the very last straw that broke the camel's back of his patience and grievances. Since then, Ferdinand Magellan, completely disillusioned with the justice and mercy of his king and fatherland, essentially became a political emigrant and an outcast. In 1517, he secretly left Portugal and moved to neighboring and rival Spain. The Portuguese authorities and public opinion could view this act of his as outright treason and defection to the side of the main enemies and competitors. He settled in the large Spanish port city of Seville, which at that time was the main center for preparing and dispatching Spanish expeditions to the New World. There he found himself among other Portuguese emigrants like himself, sailors, merchants, and scholars, dissatisfied with King Manuel's policy and seeking to apply their talents and knowledge in the service of the Spanish crown. In the same year, 1517, Ferdinand Magellan married the daughter of another influential Portuguese emigrant, Diogo Barbosa, who held a prominent position in Seville and had connections at the Spanish court. Magellan's wife was named Beatriz Barbosa. Unfortunately, very little is known about this young and, apparently, charming woman. She bore Magellan 2 children, a son and a daughter, but both died in infancy. Beatriz herself also did not live to see her husband return from his great and tragic voyage and died in Spain, either having received false news of his death, or earlier, when his name in his homeland, Portugal, was once again slandered and anathematized. And he was slandered, as we have already seen, repeatedly and from all sides. Even during his service in Portugal, strange and absurd rumors constantly circulated about him, that while fighting for the Portuguese crown in Africa and India, he showed some unexpected and suspicious leniency and even sympathy towards the Moors, that is, Muslim Arabs. For example, he once arbitrarily returned to some Moorish sheikh a herd of cattle that had been captured by the Portuguese as war booty. Did this not mean that he was secretly in some illicit and treacherous connection with the Moors, enemies of Christianity? Of course, he most likely had no such connection. Ferdinand Magellan's entire subsequent life and activities clearly showed that he treated any local native population, professing a different faith and having a different culture, exactly as all other European colonizers and conquistadors of that cruel era did, that is, with arrogance, contempt, and ruthlessness. A 16th-century hidalgo, finding himself in the conditions of colonial war, very easily and quickly turned into a ruthless hidalgo conquistador. Nevertheless, such defamatory rumors did exist, and slander, as is known, is a terrible and difficult thing to refute. In Spain, however, Ferdinand Magellan, thanks to the patronage of his father-in-law, Diogo Barbosa, and other influential people, managed to find understanding and patrons among some educated and far-sighted individuals close to the royal court. It was there that, relying on his knowledge, experience, and, possibly, some secret maps and information obtained by him during his service in the East, he put forward his bold and grandiose project to find a western sea route to the rich spice islands, that is, to the Moluccas, in Southeast Asia, and he was ready to lead such an expedition himself and personally sail to these desired islands, not by the traditional eastern route, circumnavigating Africa, which was already well known and completely controlled by the Portuguese, but by a new, uncharted, and much more dangerous western route, moving across the Atlantic Ocean and trying to find some strait or passage through the recently discovered American continent. He firmly believed that such a passage in the south of the American continent must exist, and that, by passing through it, it would be possible to reach the South Sea, discovered by Balboa, and further, the Spice Islands, which, according to his calculations, should have been in the Spanish sphere of influence according to the Treaty of Tordesillas. Magellan's proposal, after some hesitation and doubt, interested several influential and enlightened Spanish dignitaries and merchants, who counted not only on the fame of discoverers, but also on obtaining huge material benefits and income from such an expedition in case of its success. Thus, once again, the high thirst for scientific discoveries and geographical knowledge was closely and inextricably intertwined with the low and quite earthly thirst for gold, spices, and other material acquisitions. Difficulties with financing were significant, but Magellan, thanks to his perseverance and the support of the influential Juan de Aranda, head of the Seville Casa de Contratación, or House of Trade, was able to overcome them. He was also helped by the astronomer Rui Falero, a fellow Portuguese emigrant, who provided cosmographical calculations that confirmed, albeit erroneously, the possibility of such a route. Ultimately, Ferdinand Magellan was presented to the young Spanish king Charles I, who was the grandson of those very famous Catholic monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand, and who would soon also become the powerful Holy Roman Emperor under the name Charles V. And he, after long discussions and consultations with his advisors and experts, approved Magellan's risky project and agreed to finance his expedition. However, Magellan's confidence that he would be able to reach the Spice Islands relatively quickly and easily by a western route was based on some significant errors and inaccuracies made by himself and his chief cosmographer and astronomer Rui Falero in preliminary calculations of the Earth's size and the extent of the oceans. In particular, Falero, like many other European scholars of that time, significantly, by about 3,000 kilometers, underestimated the length of the Earth's equator. And this, naturally, had enormous significance for calculating all other distances and the duration of the voyage. As a result, it seemed to them that the Spice Islands, if sailing west, were significantly closer to America than they actually were. Perhaps it was a good thing that they were so mistaken, because otherwise, knowing the true scale of the Pacific Ocean, people might hardly have dared to undertake such an almost insane and mortally dangerous enterprise. One of the main navigational problems of that time was the accurate determination of longitude in the open sea, which led to large errors in calculations and made such voyages extremely risky. Magellan and his navigators relied on measuring the angular distance between the moon and certain stars, but this method was complex and inaccurate. Before setting sail, on March 22, 1518, Ferdinand Magellan signed an official agreement, or capitulation, with the Spanish king Charles I, in which the king gave him instructions characteristic of that era. May you set out in good time for discoveries in that part of the ocean sea, which, according to the demarcation line, lies within our borders and our jurisdiction. And these discoveries you must make in such a way as not to discover in any way or permit any other affairs within the borders and demarcation of the most serene King of Portugal, my beloved and dear uncle and brother, and not to cause any harm to him or his subjects in doing so. All this, of course, was sheer diplomatic hypocrisy, political maneuvering, and ostentatious international caution. In other secret documents and orally, it was clearly and unequivocally established exactly what share of all future booty, captured lands, and received income would go to whom. How much to Magellan himself as head of the expedition, how much to his chief assistant and astronomer Rui Falero, who, however, at the last moment refused to participate in the voyage due to bad omens, how much to the other participants, and, of course, what lion's share, to the Spanish crown itself. The insatiable thirst for gold and profit, which had already become almost a national tradition and the main driving force of Spanish colonial policy, already then, at the beginning of the 16th century, began to gradually undermine and ruin Spain, so that by the 17th century, after a period of incredible prosperity and power, it turned into an economically backward and politically dependent backwater of Western Europe. But for now, in Magellan's era, no one, of course, yet understood or foresaw this. The thorough and lengthy preparation of Magellan's expedition was secretly hindered and harmed in every possible way by numerous Portuguese agents and spies operating in Spain. They tried to disrupt the outfitting of the ships, bribed officials, and spread defamatory rumors about Magellan. As a result, Magellan received from the Spanish authorities, instead of new and reliable ships, 5 old, worn-out, and poorly equipped vessels, low-quality, almost rotten flour and salted meat, which quickly began to spoil Putian route, and so on. The crew was assembled with great difficulty and consisted of representatives of very different nationalities: Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, French, Germans, Greeks, and even one Englishman, which created additional difficulties in management and potential conflicts. But now he, a former disgraced Portuguese officer, held the high title of Spanish admiral and captain general of the entire flotilla. For his ambition, this was undoubtedly extremely important. And to those few who dared to embark with him on this dangerous voyage and return alive from it, King Charles I solemnly promised to grant nobility and other rewards. On August 10, 1519, the long-awaited departure of Magellan's flotilla from the Spanish port of Seville down the Guadalquivir River finally took place, and then, after some delay in the port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, on September 20th, into the open Atlantic Ocean. 5 small ships set off into the unknown. The flagship Trinidad, on which Magellan himself was, as well as the San Antonio, Concepción, Victoria, and Santiago. None of the almost 300 daredevils who embarked on this voyage then knew their future fate, and their fate would be very different and mostly tragic. The San Antonio, the largest ship in the flotilla during the passage of the Strait of Magellan, would betray its admiral, mutiny, and arbitrarily return to Spain. The Santiago, the smallest ship, would wreck and sink off the coast of Patagonia even before the discovery of the strait. The flagship Trinidad, after Magellan's death, would attempt to cross the Pacific Ocean in the opposite direction, but would be captured by the Portuguese near the Moluccas, and later also sink. The Concepción would be burned by the exhausted and desperate sailors themselves in the area of the Philippine Islands, when, due to a shortage of men and poor condition, there would be no possibility of continuing the voyage on this badly damaged ship and reaching home. And only one single small ship, bearing the proud and, as it turned out, prophetic name Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastián Elcano, would manage, after incredible hardships and dangers, to circumnavigate the globe and, almost 3 years later, on September 6, 1522, return to Spain. On board would be only 18 emaciated, half-dead from hunger and disease Europeans, and a few natives from the Spice Islands. Magellan, upon entering the Atlantic Ocean, immediately set a course not strictly west, as might have been expected, but significantly south-southwest, towards the coast of Brazil. With this cunning and unexpected maneuver, he apparently wanted not only to avoid meeting Portuguese ships off the coast of Africa, but also to confuse possible Portuguese spies and pirates, who would undoubtedly have been glad to intercept and sink his small and vulnerable flotilla. He was not just searching for unknown sea routes to the fabulous riches of the East, but also constantly feared accidentally or intentionally crossing that very conventional demarcation line established by the Pope, and an undesirable encounter with the Portuguese in their sphere of influence. And he feared this, as subsequent events showed, by no means without serious reason. At the very last minute, just before sailing from Seville, A certain young and educated Italian nobleman from Vicenza, named Antonio Pigafetta, boarded one of the ships of the flotilla, either on someone's influential recommendation or simply out of curiosity. He turned out to be, by his vocation and talent, a born chronicler and observer. The authentic ship's log, or diary, which Ferdinand Magellan himself, as befits a captain, carefully kept throughout the voyage, unfortunately, has not survived in its original form. Almost all of Magellan's papers and maps perished with one of his ships, which was later captured by the Portuguese. But Antonio Pigafetta's detailed and fascinating diary entries, which he scrupulously kept throughout the entire expedition, miraculously survived and were later published. And this is a unique, captivating, and for the most part reliable story of Magellan's great and tragic voyage, told by its direct participant and eyewitness. Pigafetta became not only a chronicler, but also a loyal associate of Magellan, highly valuing his leadership qualities and courage, and his notes are an invaluable source of information about the customs, traditions, and languages of the peoples encountered. The travelers moved south along the uncharted and deserted eastern coast of the South American continent for a rather long and difficult time, constantly searching for the supposed passage to the South Sea. They crossed the Atlantic Ocean on the whole relatively successfully, though not without storms and difficulties. Where the southern and cold part of modern Argentina is now located, they discovered and mapped a vast and sparsely populated geographical region, which they named Patagonia. This harsh part of South America is not very far from icy Antarctica. It is often very cold there, strong winds blow, and the climate is very inhospitable. Europeans first saw tall and strong local natives there, dressed in coarse skins of guanacos and other wild animals. On their feet, they had some primitive footwear, also made of skins, resembling large, clumsy felt boots or bast shoes to Europeans. This footwear made their feet visually very large, like animal paws. Pata, in Spanish, precisely means paw or hoof. That is why the surprised and somewhat frightened Spanish sailors named these local inhabitants Patagonians, that is, big-footed, or born with paws. The local population, living in Stone Age conditions, had never before seen white Europeans, their huge floating houses, or firearms. The natives, according to Pigafetta's description, were very tall, strong, hardy, and, apparently, very dangerous in case of conflict. Towards them, Ferdinand Magellan, like most European colonizers of that era, behaved like a true, ruthless, and treacherous conquistador. The expedition's chronicler Antonio Pigafetta, with naive admiration and without a shadow of condemnation, tells in his diary how cunningly and skillfully Captain General Magellan once captured two of these mighty and trusting Patagonian giants by deception. He first won their favor by giving them many colorful glass beads, small mirrors, knives, and other cheap European trinkets, which were specially carried on ships in large quantities for such purposes. When the unsuspecting natives had their hands full of these shiny and attractive, but useless to them, things, Magellan began to offer them some other shiny metal objects, nepanyatni to them, and with signs showed, "Come on, I'll put these beautiful iron ornaments on you for beauty." And the trusting natives, not expecting a trick, themselves allowed heavy leg shackles to be put on their feet. When they finally realized what had happened and tried to break free, it was already too late. One of them, it is true, possessing superhuman strength, still managed to break free and escape, but the second remained captive and later died on the ship. Ferdinand Magellan, who, according to testimonies, always cared for his sailors in a fatherly way and even helped them with his personal funds, at the same time, like most of his European contemporaries, did not see these savage natives with their incomprehensible culture and customs as full-fledged human beings, equal to himself. And this, unfortunately, is a very characteristic and tragic feature of that entire cruel and contradictory era of great geographical discoveries and the beginning of colonial expansion. Further sailing along the increasingly harsh and inhospitable coasts of Patagonia, proved to be extremely difficult, long, and exhausting. The harsh winter of the southern hemisphere began. The already meager food ration was significantly reduced. Captain General Magellan still firmly and confidently insisted on the imminent discovery of a mysterious passage that would inevitably lead them all to the desired and fabulously rich Spice Islands. But this saving passage was still not found. On the ships, among the exhausted, hungry, and despairing crew, a dull discontent, grumbling, and open disobedience were growing stronger. The opinion became widespread that this foreigner Magellan, a Portuguese in Spanish service, did not know the right way at all, that he was deliberately leading them to certain death, that he had deceived the trusting Spanish King Charles and all of them. A real, well-organized, and very dangerous mutiny began on the ships, led by several Spanish captains and officers who had initially been dissatisfied with the appointment of a Portuguese as commander of the expedition. One of the main instigators of this mutiny, Captain Juan de Cartagena of the ship San Antonio, who was the king's personal representative and responsible for the expedition's financial affairs, had behaved defiantly and demonstratively even. Earlier, during the voyage across the Atlantic, he publicly stopped calling Magellan Captain General and showing him due respect. Magellan, with great difficulty and cunning, managed to arrest him then and place him under supervision. He was imprisoned in the hold of one of the ships, but discontent and unrest among the crew continued, and the mutiny nevertheless began on April 2, 1520, during the flotilla's wintering in the deserted bay of San Julian. After almost 8 months of exhausting and, as it seemed to many, fruitless journey, Captain Gaspar de Quesada of the Concepción and Captain Luis de Mendoza of the Victoria, as well as Cartagena, freed by them, openly raised a rebellion, seizing 3 of the flotilla's 5 ships. This was especially dangerous for Magellan because it happened very far from any civilization, at the edge of the world, where he could not count on anyone's help. However, Ferdinand Magellan, even in this critical, almost hopeless situation, did not lose his presence of mind and self-control. He always knew how to maintain icy calm and clarity of thought in any, even the most desperate situation. And this time, the matter was decided by his incredible composure, determination, cunning, and the absolute devotion of a small group of loyal men, mostly Portuguese, as well as some Spaniards, who over a long period of joint sailing had come to truly appreciate his outstanding leadership qualities, maritime experience, and iron will, and sincerely believed that only he alone was capable of leading them to their cherished goal. The suppression of the mutiny was carried out by Magellan very quickly, decisively, and cruelly, quite in the spirit of that harsh time. A knife to the throat of one of the main instigators, Captain Mendoza, and he was immediately finished off with several dagger blows. The remaining mutinous ships were blockaded and taken by storm. The instigators and most active participants in the mutiny were captured, and a so-called court-martial was immediately organized, where the chief and sole judge was the Captain General himself, who, by royal decree, had the power of life and death over all participants in the expedition. Magellan issued about 40 death sentences. However, most of the condemned he, after some deliberation, and at the urgent request of the remaining officers, nevertheless pardoned, understanding that he needed experienced sailors to continue the voyage. Several people, however, were still executed to intimidate the rest, and some, including Cartagena, were chained and kept in the hold. One of the condemned sailors was granted life only because he agreed to perform the humiliating and terrible mission of an executioner and behead his comrade, Captain Quesada. And Juan de Cartagena, as the main and unrepentant instigator of the mutiny, along with a priest who also actively incited the crew to rebellion, Magellan ordered to be marooned and left on the deserted and uninhabited coast of Patagonia when the flotilla continued its journey. The further fate of these 2 unfortunate men remained unknown. After the brutal suppression of the mutiny and the restoration of order with an iron hand, Magellan's expedition moved further south, along increasingly harsh and dangerous shores. and the great geographical discovery for the sake of which all this was undertaken nevertheless took place. On October 21st, 1520, after long and agonizing searches, a truly great and historic event occurred. The long-awaited sea passage from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific was finally discovered, the very famous Strait of Magellan. It was a narrow, winding, rocky, and extremely dangerous waterway, about 600 kilometers long, which Magellan's ships navigated for a full 38 days, battling strong headwinds, treacherous currents, and frequent storms. To this day, this strait is considered one of the most difficult and treacherous for navigation on the entire planet. Some modern large ships even today prefer not to risk it and not to go through this dangerous strait, where successful passage requires special navigational skill and great caution, but simply to circumnavigate from the south the relatively small, but also very inhospitable, Tierra del Fuego archipelago. How did Magellan manage to pass through there on his imperfect sailing ships? Perhaps it was a real miracle or just incredible luck. The situation in which this historic voyage through the strait continued was extremely difficult and tense. Already after the discovery of the strait itself, in November 1520, when the flotilla was slowly and with great difficulty advancing through its intricate and dangerous labyrinths, one of the largest and best-equipped ships of the Magellan expedition, the San Antonio, unexpectedly deserted and arbitrarily turned back. Why did its pilot, the experienced Portuguese sailor Estevão Gomes, who had initially been one of Magellan's main supporters, make such a treacherous decision? Probably he, like many others, was driven by fear of the unknown, fatigue from endless hardships and dangers, and also, perhaps, a long-hidden resentment and envy of Magellan, whose authoritarian leadership style and iron inflexibility aroused such hostile attitudes in some Spanish officers and sailors. The San Antonio safely returned to Spain, and the sailors who returned on it to justify their desertion and betrayal brazenly and shamelessly slandered Magellan before the royal court. They falsely claimed that he had deliberately deceived the king, that he was incompetent, cruel, concealed the true goals of the expedition from the crew, and even secretly hoarded found gold and other treasures. That is why those few heroes who did return alive from this terrible expedition on the Victoria later had to endure many humiliating interrogations and investigations. And meanwhile, in Spain, Magellan's unfortunate wife, Beatriz, was placed under house arrest and deprived of her means of subsistence. She died, as did her little son, without ever seeing the return of her slandered and deceased husband. And meanwhile, Magellan's remaining 3 small ships, the Trinidad, Concepción, and Victoria, after a difficult 38-day voyage through the strait, finally emerged into the boundless and completely unknown to Europeans expanses of a new huge ocean. The longest, most difficult, and most tragic stage of their journey began. An almost 4-month voyage across the Pacific Ocean. Very soon, terrible hunger and scurvy began on the ships. Of course, the sailors tried to catch fish, but this was completely insufficient to feed more than 150 men. It came to the point that the starving people ate ship rats, which they sold to each other for huge sums of money, boiled and chewed leather wrappings from spars and sails, and sawdust. Even such disgusting food was considered a delicacy. Many died of hunger, thirst, and scurvy. Navigation in this vast, landmarkless ocean was incredibly difficult. The only hope was the sun by day and the stars by night, but frequent clouds and fogs hid them too. Determining latitude with an astrolabe or quadrant was a familiar task, but accurately determining longitude remained an unsolvable problem, leading to huge errors in calculating the distance traveled. In the southern hemisphere, Magellan and his navigators observed stars and constellations unknown to Europeans, including 2 nebulae later named the Magellanic Clouds, which became an important contribution to astronomy and cartography. Finally, in March 1521, after 100 days of incredible hardships and suffering, Magellan's exhausted and weakened ships approached the first inhabited islands in the western Pacific Ocean, which would later be named the Marianas. And then they reached larger and richer islands, which we know today as the Philippines. Magellan named this archipelago the Islands of St. Lazarus, as they were discovered on this saint's day. But another name, given in honor of the then Spanish crown prince, the future King Philip II, later stuck. Here in the Philippines, Magellan gave his exhausted crew a long-awaited respite, an opportunity to replenish supplies of fresh water and food. He himself, a deeply religious man devoted to his mission, was captivated by a new, as it seemed to him, noble and important prospect to convert the local pagan population to Christianity and thereby expand the possessions of the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church. It can be said that at first, this endeavor was quite successful. Many local chiefs and their subjects, impressed by the power of the Europeans and their firearms, as well as attracted by promises of patronage and profitable trade, rather easily agreed to accept baptism. Perhaps this was also due to the special syncretic nature of their own pagan beliefs, a certain religious indifference stemming from a complete misunderstanding of what this new god actually meant to the white newcomers. The natives, apparently, were not at all against simply adding to their numerous local gods and spirits another, new, and, as it seemed to them, powerful god of the white men. Only much later did they gradually begin to realize that recognizing the Christian God and his uniqueness also meant for them the need to completely renounce their ancient traditions, customs, and beliefs, as well as to unconditionally recognize the political authority of some distant and unknown white ruler, the Spanish king. For the acceptance of Christianity in that era by European discoverers and colonizers was automatically and without any discussion considered as the voluntary or forced acceptance by the natives of Spanish or Portuguese citizenship. Magellan sincerely believed in his missionary role, but this faith was combined in him with a pragmatic desire to secure Spanish influence in the newly discovered lands, which was an integral part of his agreement with the king. Soon, inevitable strife, conflicts, and feuds began between the rulers and chiefs of individual Philippine islands. Some of them, like Raja Humabon of Cebu Island, who became Magellan's ally, were in favor of establishing friendly relations and submitting to the white newcomers, while others, like, for example, Chief Lapu-Lapu of the neighboring small island of Mactan, categorically and proudly refused to recognize foreign authority over themselves and accept a foreign god. Ferdinand Magellan, as a loyal servant of the Spanish crown and a zealous Christian, was inevitably drawn into these local internecine conflicts. He decided that Chief Lapu-Lapu's resistance was another rebellion and open disobedience, which needed to be immediately and cruelly suppressed by force of arms to show everyone else his power and determination. And he, underestimating the enemy's strength and determination, as well as overestimating his own capabilities, suffered a crushing and tragic defeat. There were too many well-armed and brave native warriors on Lapu-Lapu's side who knew the terrain perfectly and skillfully used their traditional weapons, bamboo spears with fire-hardened or poisoned tips, wooden shields, bows, and arrows. Ferdinand Magellan was true to himself and his duty to the very last minute. On April 27, 1521, during a reckless and poorly prepared attack on Mactan Island, when it became clear that the superior native forces were gaining the upper hand and the Spaniards, having suffered heavy losses, panicked and rushed into the surf towards their boats to quickly sail away to the ships. He, as a true captain, remained on the shore, covering the retreat of his few surviving comrades. He was twice seriously wounded, first by a poisoned arrow in the leg and then by a spear in the arm, and, falling into the water, was surrounded and finished off by enraged natives. He was only 41 years old. The Spaniards, shocked by the death of their admiral, later tried to ransom or beg for his body from the victorious natives, to bury him with due honors, but they were flatly and contemptuously refused. Chief Lapu-Lapu proudly declared that they would keep the body of the white leader they had killed as a war trophy and as a frightening example to all others. Part of this body, according to some reports, was then displayed on spears for public viewing, as was customary in those savage and cruel times. Now, on Mactan Island, on the supposed site of Ferdinand Magellan's death, a modest monument stands in his honor. In his homeland, Portugal, Ferdinand Magellan was never truly appreciated or forgiven. And where was his true homeland now? In Portugal, he was still considered a traitor who had defected to the service of the main enemy, and his family coat of arms, by order of the king, was removed from the gates of his ancestral estate. In Spain, however, despite all his great discoveries, he was, for a long time, perceived mainly as a man who never reached the final goal of his expedition, the Spice Islands, and failed to return. Only a year after his tragic death, on September 6th or 7th, 1522, did the only surviving ship of his flotilla, the small and exhausted Victoria, under the command of the Basque navigator Juan Sebastián Elcano, who was elected captain after Magellan's death, return to the Spanish port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda and then to Seville. On board this ship were only 18 half-dead from hunger and disease Europeans and a few natives from the Moluccas. They became the first people in history to complete a full circumnavigation of the globe. Upon their return, they discovered they had lost one day in their calendar, which became the first practical proof of the need for an international dateline and confirmation of westward movement. Juan Sebastián Elcano, as the man who completed this great enterprise, received some honors from the Spanish King Charles, a personal coat of arms depicting a globe and the motto, "You were the first to circumnavigate me, primus circumdedisti me," as well as the promise of a lifelong pension, which, however, he never truly received. Instead, all the returning sailors, including Elcano, had to endure long and humiliating interrogations by royal officials and the Inquisition. Where was all the gold that Magellan had allegedly found? Why was the cargo of precious spices brought back so small compared to what was recorded in the ship's logs? And Captain Elcano had to patiently explain that the main cargo they had brought from the Moluccas consisted mainly of cloves, and that during the very long and difficult return voyage across the Indian and Atlantic Oceans, it had dried out considerably, and its weight, naturally, had significantly decreased. However, even the small quantity of spices that they did manage to bring back on the Victoria was quite sufficient to more than cover all the expenses for outfitting the entire expedition, and for the royal treasury not to be at a loss, receiving a significant profit. In this amazing and tragic story of the first circumnavigation, as in many other great deeds of that era, everything was closely and inextricably intertwined. Great and insatiable human greed, and noble, selfless thirst for knowledge and curiosity. Ferdinand Magellan undoubtedly had not only a desire for wealth and fame, but also a genuine, all-consuming desire to see with his own eyes what was actually out there, far beyond the horizon, what this huge and enigmatic globe of ours was. And he remained in history not as a successful spice merchant or a ruthless colonizer, but as a great navigator, a discoverer, as the man who first proved in practice the sphericity of the earth and the unity of the world ocean. And what remained in the geographical memory of mankind was not only the cargo of cloves he once brought back, but also the sea straits he discovered, the great Pacific Ocean he named, and, of course, the immortal name of this man himself, though far from flawless, sometimes cruel and contradictory, but undoubtedly incredibly brave, purposeful, and devoted to his great dream. His voyage changed the map of the world and people's ideas about their own planet, opening a new era in the history of geographical exploration and colonial expansion, and forever linked his name with one of the greatest feats of the human spirit, and the Treaty of Zaragoza of 1529, which definitively divided the world into Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence along a meridian passing east of the Moluccas, was a direct consequence of the information obtained by Magellan's expedition and determined the geopolitical map of the world for a long time, although disputes over the ownership of the Spice Islands continued for a long time. Magellan's legacy lives on in geographical names, in history textbooks, in numerous books and films, and in the memory of the indomitable strength of the human spirit, striving for knowledge and overcoming boundaries.